Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the invited session, American Racializations Beyond Black and White, Strange Racial Subjects in the U.S. I'm Martin Manalansan from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I'm very proud and excited to hear the papers today, as I know you are. But to start, for some reason, the program committee saw it fit to have the discussants come in first, which is very odd. And so in an act of defiance, and I know some of you might not like it, but that's the way it's going to be, we're going to have the two discussants last, okay? So the first speaker, I'm going to introduce them, and they will, I'll introduce everyone, and then they will present in the order that, not in the order that's in the schedule. So Stan Thangaraj will speak first. So let me introduce Stan Thangaraj, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at the City College of New York. His work looks at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, and citizenship, and is the winner of the 2015 American Studies Association Comparative Ethnic Studies Prize. He is the author of Desi Hoop Dreams. By the way, their books are right in front of them. Feel free to look at them later. Desi Hoop Dreams, Pick Up Basketball and the Making of Asian American Masculinity, and one of the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Asian American Sporting Cultures, both books from NYU Press. Stan takes his inspiration from women of color feminist theory and queer of color critique. The second speaker is Suhey Vega, who's an assistant professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University. Using ethnography, oral history, and archival analysis, Dr. Vega's work explores the lived impact of anti-immigrant policies and rhetoric. Her book, Latino Heartland, of Borders and Belonging in the Midwest, weaves Latino and non-Latino voices from central Indiana to understand notions of belonging during a heightened moment in immigration politics. Her current project locates another previously under-recognized experience, that of Latinas and Latinos in the Mormon Church, and the role of the LDS Church plays in the lives of current Latino Mormons. The third speaker is Samuel K. Bird. And Samuel is an anthropologist whose PhD is from the City University of New York Graduate Center and adjunct assistant professor at Hunter College. His research interests include music, urban life, immigration, and the U.S. South. He lives in Manhattan and with his wife and two daughters. The next speaker is Ahmad Afzal, and let's see. Oh, here it is. Ahmad Afzal received his bachelor's degree in Third World Studies from Vassar, Master of Science with distinction in Cultural Geography from LSE, and a doctorate of Philosophy and Cultural Anthropology from Yale in 2005. He has taught at Colgate University, Purchase College, and currently California State University at Stanislaus. Dr. Afzal's research interests include globalization, transnationalism, and the nation state, and particularly South Asian immigrants in North America, urban anthropology, South Asian media industries in the West, Indian cinema, Bollywood, and gender and sexuality cross-culturally. This paper he's presenting today is accepted from a chapter from his recently published monograph, Lone Star State Muslims, Transnational Lives, American Dreams, and South Asian Muslims in Texas, and from New York University Press, 2014. Our two discussants who will present, the first of the discussants is Gina Perez, who is a professor in Comparative American Studies program at Oberlin. She is the author of the new book, Citizen, Student, Soldier, Latino Youth, JROTC, and the American Dream, which has been published with NYU Press. Just like an NYU Press extravaganza. She is also the author of The Near Northwest Side, Migration, Displacement, and Puerto Rican Families, University of California Press, which was awarded the Delmas Jones and Jagna Scharf Memorial Prize for the critical study of North America by the Society for the Anthropology of North America. She's co-editor with Frank Guridi and Adrian Burgos of the 2011 anthology Beyond El Barrio, Everyday Life in Latino America, also from NYU Press. The last of the and final presenter and the second discussant is John L. Jackson Jr., who is Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Richard Berry University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. His latest book is Impolite Conversations on Race, Politics, Sex, Money, on race, politics, sex, money, and religion, co-authored with award-winning journalist Cora Daniels. His most recent film, co-directed with Deborah A. Thomas, is Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens.
Thank you very, very much. But before I start my paper, just to acknowledge some folks and to begin with something we cannot forget, that Black Lives Matter, and with ongoing violence across our universities and campuses, it is important to stress this. And I want to thank Suohe for organizing this amazing panel and all the labor she put into it, and to John and Gina for just giving us such the honor of being the discussants for our panel. And I'm grateful to my mentors, Martin, Junaid, Dave, and Nancy, who have shaped my work, and for Alejandro Lugo, who is here, who has been a lifeline. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues at CCNY, Professor Loti Silber, Arthur Spears, and Asha Samad Mateus. So as the US state and xenophobic sentiments continue to organize and conflate Arabs, Muslims, South Asians, Middle Easterners as terrorists, the everyday lived experiences and folk knowledge of race varies tremendously. This paper attempts to get at the messiness of racial formations by looking at South Asian Americans and Kurdish Americans, two very strange racial figures in the familiar black-white racial logic. Although both groups appear in institutional records in various ways and in the census form as Caucasian, they have endured various racial formations which further demonstrate the instability and multiplicity of race and whiteness. Race within South Asian American communities has never been constant or consistent. Early in US history, the racial formation of Hindu essentialized early Punjabi, Muslim, and Sikh farmers as Hindus outside the binary racial logic, unfit for citizenship, and apart from the racial heteronormative standards of family. The case of Bhagat Singh Thind in 1923 highlights how the unfamiliar racial figure of the South Asian makes strange and inconsistent the normative racial logic. Thind called for citizenship on the grounds of South Asians being classified by racial science as Caucasian. The court rejected the claim and denied him citizenship by saying that although racial science upheld his status, the common white man would not recognize him as white. Thus, he was culturally outside the racial logic that also utilized biological conceptions of race, which was determined by white male homosociality. Whiteness was something outside of his grasp, and he could not make claims to blackness, and he did not choose to make claims to blackness as citizenship. In this paper, the varying figures of the South Asian and Kurdish American demonstrate the shifting and exclusionary politics of whiteness, blackness, and otherness that play out in the US South in familiar, strange, and contradictory ways. In my book, which is featured on the table, with the familiar, rigid, black-white racial logic of the US South, South Asian Americans' racial ambiguity in Atlanta allowed them to move through various spaces unlike their black counterparts. This racial ambiguity was part of a racial strangeness that was distinct from the toughness and threat of black masculinity in sporting cultures. Thus, when two of my main informants, Mustafa and Ali, when their family lived in LaGrange, Georgia, these men could play at either the white or black segregated gym in 1990. The young South Asian American would also play in ethnic Asian American and Latino leagues without roadblocks, while African Americans and black athletes were highly policed. With the rise of Latinos in the US South, they are now at times raised and classified under the newly familiar racial category of quote-unquote Mexican. Yet the familiar racial categories of black and white were used often. Black and white were used as part of a racial grammar that set the standards for racial interpretation and interaction based on class. White and black extended beyond African American and white bodies. They are historical metaphors to talk about class difference and the politics of respectability within South Asian America. Here's one example where the common racial lexicon is used to dissect and understand difference within South Asian America. So I was playing and watching several of these teams, and Ali was playing in a multiracial citywide league where the participants were mostly white and upper-class players. He played on a team that was comprised mostly of South Asian Americans, and their opponents were a white team. After the game, with this team barely winning by a few points, Ali and I carried on our conversation in the parking lot. Sweating through on a hot summer Atlanta day, all of a sudden, we heard a loud screeching of car tires. We both turned around quickly to see a light gray new BMW rush through the parking lot. It was Malik, one of the children of the 1965 professional immigrant waves. We both looked at each other. We shook our head in disbelief and belief at this shenanigans involving Malik. Ali at this moment told me, Malik, he is so white. But you know my brothers, Mustafa and Qamar, they're black. They had it tough. When I prodded deeper about what exactly these terms mean and meant, I noticed how a lot of players would self-reference as quote-unquote white. Players did not self-reference as black, but rather referenced other South Asians as black, regardless of the black stylistics or urban aesthetics that they sported. Players used white for diasporic normativity, which further ingrained the racial formation of model minority as the familiar template of South Asian identity. Black stood for the failed male subjects within South Asian America. It often referenced young men who came through the Family Preference Acts and did not have the resources like professional status, college education, and strong social networks. When the term black was used, it referenced traits of aggressiveness, toughness, frequent bouts of fighting, donning on too much of the black aesthetic where the line between style and body was blurred, falling outside the markers of middle-class respectability, and taking part in the underground economy. Thus, in relation to Mustafa and Qamar, who did not attend good schools, did not have vast social networks, and were employed in precarious situations and jobs, Ali considered Malik and himself as white. But when it came to the matter of the familiar ways in which we understand race and its particular biological history, there were very different terms for racial and racist communicative competence. Instead of using English language and vernacular to mark certain racialized masculinities as matter out of place, most of the Desi basketball players used South Asian idioms to create their acceptable US racial arrangements. Although there is a word Gora in Indo-European languages for white people, that term rarely ever surfaced on the basketball court. On the other hand, the term Kallu for black and African Americans was prevalent on and off the court. Although this term originated to mark a difference as dirt between light-skinned and dark-skinned South Asians, it has become common within South Asian America to mark black bodies in general and lower-class black persons in particular as non-normative figures in South Asian America and in US society. It originated in North Indian languages, but has become commonplace in South Asian America regardless of one's ancestral language. It is a way of navigating race and racial difference. Daniel, a Malayali American, and Sanjit, a Punjabi Sikh American, informed me that their white friends, if they knew one South Asian term, it was the term Kallu. Whiteness and white bodies thus move in and out of South Asian American sporting cultures and spaces without the same type of policing as blacks. Sanjit, at 6'2" and over 230 pounds, said with frustration about his life playing, recreational basketball, quote, "The Kallus made it impossible to play A-League intramurals at college," end quote. The black men and their blackness had biological and cultural valences, both seen as my gay informant Muslim Sharif told me as less than ideal. On the physical level, Sanjit and other South Asian American players racialized African American men as Kallu, which over-determined their athletic aptitude, foreground a thuggish mentality, while making themselves the respectable sporting figure. At an Asian American tournament, Mohammed and Mustafa were watching a South Asian team Atlanta franchise play. And Mohammed shook his head with discontent and told Mustafa, "Man, they play Kallu style of ball." Now, with the very category of Kallu was transported from bodies to cultural practices that invoked blackness. In this respect, the black working class aesthetics associated with playground, organic, and loosely policed basketball was distasteful for Mohammed to watch. It was an act of policing. For these athletes that grew up on the playground playing in organic versions of basketball, their basketball skill set, understanding of the space, and moving on the court were dictated through spontaneous recreational basketball, but not valued across all sporting spaces. And now when we move from the South Asian Americans to my newest project on Kurdish American refugees in the US South with a focus on Nashville, unlike the South Asian American men who are immigrants, Kurdish Americans in Nashville came through refugee waves in the late 1970s, 80s, and 90s, whereas South Asian Americans used black and white bodies and the terms black and white as the racial compass to adjudicate racial belonging and cultural citizenship. Kurds have multiple and complicated relationships to race that is further confounded by various imperialisms that invoke whiteness and Arabness. With a history of settler colonialism by Arabs, Turks, and Persians, Kurds are racialized in everyday discourse and in institutional records in the Middle East. For example, in Turkey, the Kurds were referred to as quote-unquote mountain Turks and as a way of identifying difference from the Turkish national subject. In their own exertions of agency, Kurds relied on racial language to further underscore difference from Arabs and Arab Americans as a way to challenge the legitimacy of Arab imperialisms. When I met Diyar for an interview and dinner, he showed me a comprehensive encyclopedia and stated something that other Kurds had mentioned, a commonality between South Asians and Kurds and long histories of communication and intimacy. And I was quite surprised. I am much darker skinned than he was, but he said that we were both Indo-European. He then pointed to the encyclopedic section on language families. He mentioned that we are both Indo-European. I shook my head and I said, "No, I'm Dravidian." This did not suffice, and he said, "Do you have people in your country with blue eyes?" Yeah. He then pointed to difference from Arabs who he said were Semitic and not Indo-European. Here we see how the language of race coded in the category of Indo-European allows for claims to whiteness while concurrently pushing Arabs out of that category. This use of Indo-European is a key marker for difference from the census forms that categorize both Kurds and Arabs as white. Furthermore, the post-9/11 hysteria and the global war on terror conflates various ethnic, religious, and national groups in the Middle East into the racial formation of Muslim-looking. Despite how mainstream classifications try to make sense of the strange racial figure of the Muslim or the Middle Easterner, some Kurds made sure that the logic that we were used to was not educated in a problematic, conflating manner. For example, when the census agency started to consider a category of Middle Easterners with a grouping of Arabs, the Kurdish Americans organized to oppose this. Here we see how Kurds disrupt the uniformity of whiteness that constituted persons of Middle Eastern heritage in the US and bifurcate it to mean Indo-European and Semitic. Yet the whiteness and the wages that come with it were exclusive. Phenotype, religious adornment, name, accent, and bodily comportment limited social mobility for several of the Kurdish Americans in Nashville, whose parents were farmers and had little social capital in the US. Dalal, one of the activists I met, said, quote, "We changed our names. So we used to have a very Arabic name. Our last name was Mohammed. Before I remember, I was at MTSU, and it was my first semester there when the Twin Towers went down. At 11 o'clock, we got a phone call from one of the newspapers in town, and they said, 'Your name was Mohammed before. You're a Muslim family. They're saying this attack was done by Muslims. What do you have to say for yourself?' So that's the thing that happened, and we immediately realized that things weren't going to go very well. So when we became citizens, we all changed our last name to Darcy, and nobody can figure out what it is," end quote. For Diyar's daughters and others, they make this moment to stress that whiteness does not give them the same privileges and wages that other whites receive. But yet at the same time, the Muslim Kurdish American activists I met who chose to headscarf, they actually chose, instead of distancing from Arabs and claiming tenuous ground as whites, these young women chose to headscarf and engaged with the racial formation of Muslim looking and took what Junaid Rana identifies as the expansive reach to create coalitions with other Middle Eastern communities and communities of color. Instead of embracing whiteness, there's potential, as the Kurdish American activists have shown, to dismantle the racial system through collaboration and community building.
So thank you, and thank you all for coming to this wonderful panel. Stan's already done a wonderful job of thanking folks that have influenced us. Stan and I went to graduate school, so because Stan did that thanking, I want to thank the panel actually for pushing the anthropology holdings to the point that we're talking about these race issues and race politics in many critical ways that may not have been talked about in the past. So I want to thank the panel as well for their wonderful work, as you see here. It was not by accident that we're all NYU authors. Stan and I coordinated this because we were so proud of what we have to offer this year. So let me start the PowerPoint. It's frozen. So while he's doing it, I'll start. As I was writing this paper, I thought of perhaps a more appropriate subtitle for today. The title of the current paper is, he's going to set it up, En Mi Casa, Latino Latter-day Saints in the Making of Complex Mormon Identities. But I thought maybe En Mi Casa, on the oohs, ahs, and oh of making the strange familiar in the anthropology of race politics was more appropriate. Here, the title of En Mi Casa, or In My House, holds meaning for both the participants in my current research project and for me, a Latina anthropologist doing research at home or within the United States amongst Latino populations. The new subtitle, however, derives from varied responses I've gotten. Over the years as an anthropologist doing work at home. Responses like, can you click it for me? Thank you. Can you ever truly learn the languages of the community you study? Right, spoken by doubting sociologists who can't imagine I could research my own linguistic community. Next one. Then there was the encounter with me and a colleague. Me, hey Rudy, welcome back to the States. How was New Zealand? Him, it was great. Hey, how was, where do you do research again? Me, Utah. Him, oh. Me, it's okay, I get this all the time. And lastly, the comment I get often from white male colleagues who have a skewed sense of anthropologists. Them, oh, you're an anthropologist. You're all so much fun. You really know how to party. I met up with this archaeologist at a bar once. Hey, what do you study? Me, the US, the impact of anti-immigration rhetoric and white privilege. Them, oh, huh. I begin with these statements because as I'm sure my fellow colleagues on this panel can attest to, we came up in the field of anthropology where studies of and within the United States, racial politics was growing, but work in the US was still seen as someone's secondary project. what one did after real field work abroad, or if one was stuck without external funding. In addition, dealing with racism in the US context was still placed within black-white binaries, such that some of my favorite AAA memories involve events or talks sponsored by the ABA. Importantly for me, ALA was also a welcoming space where Latino ethnography was finally discussed. Still, even within these circles, Latino ethnography remained a conversation of urban centers or traditional settling locations, like the Southwest. So when I chose to unpack the Latino experience in central Indiana, I was greeted then, as I am now, with quixotic expressions of, huh, or wow, or worse, why? For me, making the strange familiar means pushing beyond the black and white binary toward embracing opportunities for coalition and comparative analysis that deepens our understanding of race politics as it impinges on multiple communities in a myriad of ways. But it also means moving beyond traditional recognized sites of analysis. That means looking at Latinos in supposed new settling destinations, even if they are not so much new as they were never previously recognized. It also means looking at communities of color within spaces once considered homogeneously white. This could be in the suburbs, the exurbs, in politics, or as in my case, in religious institutions entrenched in white anity theology. For roughly 3 years, I collected narratives of both white and Latino residents in Indiana on immigration and the lived impact of the political rhetoric. Listening to racial slurs or about dehumanizing encounters during the 2006 immigration debate was difficult but necessary. Equally necessary for me was locating the spaces of survival or the everyday tactics of contesting otherwise oppressive environments. As a lapsed Catholic and a cynical academic, I did not set out to explore religion as a site of inquiry. The ethnography gods, however, had other plans. Indeed, it was being introduced to Latino Mormons in Indiana that inspired the work I'm doing now. Currently, I find myself living in Arizona, a state whose immigration politics need no further introduction. And like Indiana, I'm hungry to learn about the ways that Latino residents survive, combat, or undermine the systems of power that target them. Though focused in the US Southwest, I posit that the strangeness of peculiar difference of being Latino and Mormon, as well as the multi-sided incorporation of Latinos in Utah, expands our knowledge of familiar yet strange encounters with US processes of racialization. Moreover, exploring the leadership roles and, yes, feminism of Latina women in Mormonism might also read strange to some. Placed in a particular border zone of belonging, this project focuses on Mesa, Arizona, a city honored with the label of the most conservative city in the country, with a heavily right and white-leaning electorate. Yet a drive through Mesa also reveals signage in Spanish, taquerias, and cars thumping to Spanish music. Similarly, one can equally find drivers listening to conservative talk radio with "Don't Tread on Me" stickers on their vehicles. These worlds collided and ruptured in 2010 when Russell Pierce introduced SB 1070. Russell Pierce made a national name for himself with 1070, and living within his district meant daily encounters between supporters and protesters of the bill. When I arrived in 2011, the tension intensified during the successful recall of Pierce that pit Mormons against Mormons. For instance, one local resident recalled an encounter outside the public library where an older retired man literally pushed a woman who dared voice disagreement with Pierce. Police were called, and the library had to maintain a security presence for weeks to follow. A Mormon himself, Pierce repeated church dictates about following the law in his rhetoric. Meanwhile, more moderate Latino and white LDS members, right, and LDS is short for Latter-day Saints, were openly organizing to oust him. They wrote and demanded compassionate leadership on immigration from Salt Lake City. A Latina in Mesa would not wait for Mormon headquarters to respond. In her 60s at the time, Patti grew incensed at the stories from other Latino hermanos and hermanas, sisters and brothers, whose ward met at the same space as that of Pierce. So within the LDS kind of practice, you have wards, which are basically congregations, and sometimes they meet in the same physical spaces or meeting houses. The Latino members felt inundated with subtle and overt messages that they were not welcome there. Bhatti brought this up to white elders, right, and here elders doesn't mean that they're actually older than her. She critiqued the presence of political flyers within the walls of their meeting house. She demanded that the pro-Pierce flyers be taken down. As she remembered during our interview, quote, "I mean, ¿qué es eso? They shouldn't have had them up in the first place." Indeed, Bhatti and so many others did not appreciate the uncomfortable, and I might add illegal, blending of church and state on the issue. I started doing interviews with Latino Mormons in Arizona precisely because I wanted to understand faith-based responses to politicians like Russell Pierce. Faced with the politics of belonging within the walls of their church, as well as within the borders of their state, how were Latino Mormons coping with their marginal status within the national and religious imaginary? Did faith soothe or aggravate the precarity of Spanish-speaking members? These questions, unfortunately, expect Mormons to air their dirty laundry, something that a select few have been willing to do. For now, I focus on ethnic belonging in the church. How do Latino Mormons make home in the faith of white and delightsome people? What purpose does this faith serve in their lives? In particular, I'm interested in getting at the Latina female experience as it relates to traditional cultural and religious gender roles. Bhatti, for instance, may not be a priest holder in her church, but her active voice was strong enough to question white elders and demand that they do something about the flyers. Like in Latino Heartland, I also explore the history of Spanish-speaking Mormons in a state where their past and their current contributions are all but eradicated. I find archives, historical text, and oral histories critical for understanding the palimpsests of racial layerings in space. It should be noted that Mormons have, as part of their doctrine, a proclivity toward documenting their past. History and knowing where one comes from is built in the church's genealogy efforts. So it comes to no surprise when one member, Eva, gave me a historical chronology of the Spanish-speaking chapel in Mesa, with a notebook full of information on personal images that showcased 1940s era cars parked in front of the chapel and Latina Mormons in bouffant hairdos. Eva's enthusiasm was obvious as she sent me on a mission. I only got as far back as the 1930s. You have to go back and do the work of finding our history. With that request in mind, I took a research trip to Salt Lake City last December, where I spent 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the LDS Church History Library. And in the evening, immediately after archiving, I attended rehearsals and interviewed participants of the church Christmas Latino celebration. The interviews with LDS Latinos in Salt Lake City helped situate how they appreciate these public demonstrations of pan-Latinidad. And as one responded, "Me hizo sentir en mi casa," it made me feel at home. Here in these Latino ethnic celebrations, Mormons made the strange familiar by redrafting their religion within Latin American rituals. Foods, Spanish Christmas carols, and notions of familia extended across geographical borders from Utah to Mexico and other parts of Latin America. Presently, I'm collecting the oral histories of Latino Mormons to see how their ethnic religiosity holds meaning in Mesa. These Mormons lovingly relate worshiping together in Spanish for decades before they were disbanded by higher white LDS leadership. Women in particular recalled with tears in their eyes their memories of community and the importance of familia in the church. Women in the LDS church certainly encounter limitations and fall into traditional gender roles at home. Still, as Latino Mennonite historian Felipe Hinojosa remarks, there is a feminism within their faith that we have to account for. And that's where I go forth now. Ethnographically speaking, the kind of questions I want to ask about the politics of immigration within the church and about the racialized gendered positions all take time. In Indiana, it took time before people would openly discuss perceptions of immigration. I want to trouble the white supremacy underlining the vision of a light-skinned God in Mormon doctrine, speaking to and saving indigenous communities of the Americas. I want to address how the church can be welcoming to some while extremely inhospitable to queer and gender nonconforming members. I want to point to the juxtaposition between celebrated white motherhood and the ways Latina fertility gets politicized. I want to and I will, but I also have to be true to Latinas who are tremendously strengthened by their faith, who remake an otherwise predominantly Anglo church in their own image. What I can do now is recognize how, in their own ways, Latinos challenge who is imagined as a familiar face of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thank you.
Morning. I'd like to second the thanks for panelists and all the discussants for today. My name is Sam Bird. The title of my paper is The Strangeness of Southern Latinidad, Race, Ethnicity, and Politics in the Latino U.S. South. In this paper, I offer several critical interventions about race based on the experience of Latinos living in the Nuevo South, the globally connected, increasingly diverse, yet still racially stratified southeastern United States. In these new immigrant destinations, and I am aware of his critique of the word new, which I think is very interesting and important that we can discuss later maybe. Latinos are strange racial subjects, not fitting easily into established black-white dichotomies, yet marked as racially others through a regime of immigration policing, occupational stratification, and social marginalization. Latinos in the South also engage with notions of regional identity, negotiating what it means to be Southern and Latino. Drawing on my recent book, The Sounds of Latinidad, and ongoing research in Charlotte, North Carolina, I consider the strangeness and familiarity of the Southern Latino experience. I have three questions here that I'm trying to answer. One, what are the experience of Latinos in a medium-sized southern city, and what can it teach us about racial politics in the U.S., particularly about the way that racialization of Latino immigrants makes them into both familiar and strange subjects? So the themes of familiar and strange remind me of Leon Russell's song, Strangers in a Strange Land, a striking example of what we might call blue-eyed gospel soul, and also the title of an influential science fiction novel. That's another topic for another day. A white rock and roll musician channeling blackness is about as familiar and strange as one gets, commonplace in the popular music of the 1960s and 70s. Leon Russell's song leads me to ask whether Latino immigrants to the U.S. South are strangers in a strange land. Yes and no, according to my research among Charlotte's Latino musicians. Many of the musicians I spoke with were familiar with popular American culture and Southern music, particularly the blues and other African American folk traditions. In their creative process and musical taste, they familiarize themselves with Southern music and experiment with ways to incorporate American pop songs and cultural references into their performances. I argue that these musicians are part of a larger cultural movement, creating a Southern version of Latinidad that is looser than other conceptions and situated in conversation with the unique environment of the U.S. South. However, residential and social segregation mean that Latino musicians operate in a separate social world from both whites and blacks in Charlotte, and even other Latino immigrant groups in a different socioeconomic class or legal status. When I told white acquaintances in Charlotte that I was studying Latino musicians, I got strange looks, as if I was from some alien planet. First, they were incredulous that Latino musicians existed in Charlotte, and that I would be studying them. Yet Latino musicians often perform in well-known clubs and music venues that whites attended just on different nights. The exception to the social segregation happens at Latino cultural festivals, where mixed audiences enjoy Latino bands, food, art, and dance. By presenting a particular vision of Latino culture that appeals to a broad audience, festivals have a somewhat unifying effect, but they also gloss over class, racial, and national differences. The festivals are also beholden to corporate sponsors and must be interpreted with a critical eye that understands the version of Latinidad presented as leaning towards white or whiter, middle-class, family-friendly, apolitical, and traditional types of performances. Yet the space of the festival is a contested one, and fans, musicians, and even concert organizers sometimes try to push the boundaries of what the festival can mean by including songs and performances that challenge these types of assumptions. Since Latino activists and musicians often see themselves as Southern, it is important to pause for a moment and problematize what being Southern means. There are the traditional white notions of being Southern, typified in phrases like Southern by the grace of God, and the South shall rise again, and steeped in a continuous sense of white victimhood and persecution at the hands of Yankees and the federal government. There are the notions of the Southern business elite, starting with Henry Grady and typified by former Bank of America CEO Hugh McCall, the New South, who want a Southern version of capitalism, free from regulations and unions, but also unfettered by the dark history of the region. There are the notions of the African American generation of the 1950s and 60s, who fought for racial equality and justice and forced all Americans to confront their racial demons. But there is also Southern culture, which in its richness has been celebrated and maligned in many a media portrayal. There are the notions of the generation of whites who grew up in the desegregating 60s and 70s that felt the development of Southern rock was an avenue towards self-awareness and of their own racial privilege and an expression of common cultural threads between black and white Southerners. There's country music, which has connected themes of white Southern identity to national tropes that have sort of filtered into mainstream popular culture, American, and I should add sort of white American popular culture. There's also Southern blacks who in the 1990s developed new notions of being Southern through the creation of Southern rap and R&B that celebrated the flourishing youth culture in cities like Atlanta, Miami, and Houston, while also critiquing racist policing and drug enforcement policies, the corrupted mainstream political process, and cultural chauvinism towards the South. Thus, there are multiple ways of being Southern, some of which Latino immigrants can align themselves with and identify with, and others that they can't. When I speak with Latino political activists, they are most concerned about how immigration policing and government policies demonize immigrants and limit their opportunities to engage as full members of society. What is it that leads to this revanchism? And by revanchism, I refer to the punitive and exclusionary practices and attitudes that are prevalent in the U.S. South today towards the presence of immigrants. In part, I think it is a late imperial mindset where the U.S.'s ineffective and contradictory foreign policy, along with economic uneasiness, leads to a crisis in national read white identity. Immigrants, both familiar with through everyday visibility as laborers and strange because of perceived cultural difference, become an obsession for whites feeling unmoored. Thus emerge new processes of racial formation, such as the racialization of new immigrants and Latinos. I define, quote, Mexican as a racial term because in anti-immigrant rhetoric and indeed in current popular linguistic usage, it is deployed in ways that supersede a mere reference to nationality. Instead, Mexican has become a marker for brownness, illegal immigration status, indigenous facial features, working class culture, perceived rurality, foreignness, and accented English. Latino immigrants, in particular undocumented individuals, but by association other Latinos, are cast as criminal and subject to increasing policing and exclusion from basic rights. Paired with an expanding immigrant policing regime, this discourse makes up what Gilberto Rosas calls the borderland condition that inscribes exceptionality on immigrant bodies through everyday violence and surveillance. In the South, the rise of immigration policing at the state level parallels the conservative/neoliberal turn in state politics, where slowly Republicans replaced the last generation of white Democratic governors and state leaders in the 1990s and early 2000s. I don't have time to go through every southern state's portfolio of these sort of immigration laws, but I do want to point to the recent North Carolina bill, SB 318, which prohibits the use of the matricula consular as ID and outlaws municipalities from acting as, quote, sanctuary cities. Instead, to paraphrase a Charlotte Mecklenburg police officer in a recent community meeting with Latinos about the issue, immigrants should now always carry their passports and be prepared to present proof of their physical address through a copy of a bill or tax statement. Another Latino officer warned that not all CPMD officers son buenos, and hay algunos racistas. There's a few racists among them. So Latino community members should be wary of situations of possible abuse and should be ready to respond without hesitating with their name, address, and date of birth. This brings me to my second question. How do Latinos consent to common sense notions of racial hierarchy through their cultural production or challenge them through developing critical perspectives on their role in society? So organizing around immigration reform in the Latino and the Latin music scene provide an interesting fields through which we can analyze how Latinos consent to common sense notions of racial and class hierarchy through their cultural production, or challenge them through developing critical perspectives on their role in society. Many of the musical performances I witness reinforce common sense notions of cultural difference, what I call genre chauvinism, where the genre is in terms of national identity, tradition. Festival goers at festivals will wear flags and other national markers like soccer jerseys or traditional dress or hats. And as a whole, the Latin popular music industry constructs musical taste that favors whiteness, middle-class behavior and striving, and heteronormativity in music themes and performance. Most of Charlotte's bands follow in this vein, with some exceptions. In politics, the immigration reform marches that I went to, a type of patriotic common sense is followed, where participants erase Mexican and other Latin American national identity and stress the American qualities of Latino immigrants as students, hard workers, and small business owners. But other examples that I point out in my book highlight a more critical view of Latinos' role in U.S. society. Bands such as heavy metal group Dorian Gris use their performance practices, what one journalist dubbed the collective circle, as a way to debate intellectual questions and create rituals that momentarily overturn the dominant discourse about Mexicans. Other musicians point out the commonalities between Afro-Caribbean merengue, or bachata, and banda music from Tierra Caliente, a region of Mexico with many people of African descent. Okay. A local acoustic regional Mexicano band, Los Tarascos de Michoacán, has engaged in cross-cultural exchange with white bluegrass musicians, performing live on a local English radio station. 5? Okay. A visual artist, Rosalia Torres Wiener, paints works that present the plight of immigrants facing family separation and police surveillance, and paints murals on walls around Charlotte. In terms of political organizing, new circumstances have led to a grassroots activism that is both critical of state and federal policies while also wary and weary of traditional marches and rallies. For example, the failure to pass the DREAM Act led many young undocumented students to try different approaches to advocate for reforms, such as sit-ins, confrontations with politicians, and reaching out to their parents' generation. A group of families facing separation from their loved ones because of deportation proceedings started Familias Unidas, which provides emotional and logistical support to help families fight deportations. Finally, at the 2015 Latin American Festival, local newspaper Que Pasa Mi Gente, great name for paper, created a large poster with Donald Trump's face on it and the caption, "Tell Donald Trump what you think of him." Festival goers wrote their thoughts and insults across the poster and on his image, and I can't repeat what they wrote, because it's, anyway. This brings me to the third question. What lessons can the experience of Southern Latinos teach us about conducting a critical anthropology of the seemingly never-ending episodes of racial oppression and revanchist policing of communities of color in the United States? I'm reminded of another strange reference, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. I believe that the seemingly everyday incidents of killing and violence against blacks by police are modern-day lynchings, a continuation of state-sanctioned violence against blacks and other socially marginalized groups in this country. What can the experience of Southern Latinos add to our understanding of this moment and how anthropologists can study racial oppression and violence? First, I think looking at people's everyday lives is central. When we do this, it becomes clear that Latinos and blacks experience oppression on a daily basis, not just through high-profile incidents that make the news. The oppression stems from a crisis of whiteness, a paranoia and fear that drives campaigns against illegal immigration and against police assassinations. I put those highly in quotes. Revanchism in Charlotte and other places is based on its own logic that falls from a neoliberal cry for a right to the city, including a right to be free from illegality, being inconvenienced by the homeless, day laborers, or the poor in general, free from high taxes, and leads to restrictions on lifestyle crimes such as public drunkenness, loud music, drug use and drug dealing, violating housing codes, and informal street vending, read food trucks. In general, this is part of a process of reclaiming white public space for whites and claiming new spaces as whites encroach on neighborhoods through gentrification, without necessarily being overtly racist in the sense of encoding race-based discrimination. And so Latinos get inserted into this argument, even without really wanting to be, about race and belonging, where they are seen as the problem, vilified and stereotyped as Mexican. I argue that they turn inward to fellow Latinos to try to form a sense of community. Some become politically active while others try to avoid politics as a way to try to live a normal life. The political claims that Latinos make, however, are already sort of precluded and limited by this neoliberal framework of a right to the city, where there's very little space for their claims to try to go to college or to try to have the right to belong or to have an ID. So that's an important point. Second, I think it's important that we look at the intellectual debates within the Latino community. The bands and musicians and the political activists I studied engage in very intense debates daily about these sorts of questions about race, about ethnicity, about what it meant to be Latino. And so they try to create a sense of Southern Latinidad that exists in concert with an awareness of race and racism in both Latin America and the U.S. South. They also define themselves in terms of the term Mexican, whether or not they agree with and sort of identify in solidarity with Mexicans or not. Third, I think it's vital that we connect the struggles of blacks and Latinos in the U.S. South while also noting how limited interracial collaboration has been so far. Organizations like the Latin American Coalition have partnered with black churches to host immigration reform rallies, but a broader coalition appears stunted. Many immigration activists look to the civil rights movement for inspiration, but they draw lessons also from other social movements, such as queer struggles or indigenous peoples movements. Yet the message of solidarity for immigration reform seems unconvincing to many African Americans in Charlotte. Afro-Latinos feel little solidarity with black residents, instead focusing their community-making efforts in collaboration with fellow Latinos, particularly Mexicans, because of their common diminished social status in the city. However, solidarity does appear to be growing between Latino activists and Vietnamese and Laotian immigrants. Members of the Asian immigrant community recently founded the Southeast Asian Coalition to help advocate for individuals facing deportation. In conclusion, have we moved beyond black and white? The experience of Latino immigrants in the U.S. South suggests both yes and no. Latino immigration has sparked an intense debate about citizenship, regional and national identity, and belonging, with much of the anti-immigrant language couched in coded racial terms such as illegal and Mexican that signal a new racialization of immigrants of color. As many scholars have pointed out, Latino has always been a nebulous term that touches on ethnic, racial, linguistic, and national identities and has meant different things to people at different times and in different places. But one effect of the anti-immigrant climate in Charlotte has been to galvanize most Latinos into a clear political position where they feel empathy for the plight of undocumented immigrants and disgust at the vitriol and hatred spewed in their direction. Thus, Latino, quote unquote, has gained a clearer meaning, even if lighter-skinned Latinos still benefit from being able to associate themselves, if they choose, with whiteness. But the targeting of immigrants, policies and laws parallels a much longer and ongoing regime of oppression that targets blacks. While there's a significant and thriving African-American middle class in places like Charlotte, the last few years have shown that police violence against black bodies creates boundaries of class, crosses boundaries of class, urban, suburban, gender, and education level. There also persists a large community of poor, socially marginalized blacks in Charlotte that often get overlooked in the hype about it being a booming city. Perhaps instead of moving beyond black and white, the presence of Latinos in the U.S. South complicates things, making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Thank you.
So first, thanks to Stanley and Suhey for organizing the panel. I'm very thrilled to be included and appreciate the opportunity to share my ongoing research on South Asian radio. It's the final chapter of my recently published book, but I'm also hoping to expand it, making it more comparative. So I'm looking at South Asian ethnic radio production in major cities like New York City, in addition to Houston, also looking at San Francisco and Los Angeles as potential sites for thinking about South Asian media cultures comparatively. This paper, though, focuses on Pakistani radio programming in Houston. I contextualize it as a practice of diasporic community formation among Pakistanis in Houston. At first, the prominence of radio as a medium for constructing community among new immigrant communities in the US might appear unexpected, or to invoke the theme of the conference, strange given the rise of new media technologies such as the internet and even satellite television. The use of Urdu instead of English as the preferred language of communication on most of the Pakistani radio programs in Houston might also appear to perpetuate the foreignness or strangeness of mediated practices among new immigrant communities. Yet, as I try to show in this paper, radio can also be approached through the lens of the familiar and illuminate diasporic registers such as the uses of radio in practices of nation and community building in the homeland that make radio familiar to my Pakistani interlocutors in Houston. And at local and national levels as well, the strangeness of non-English language radio is belied by similar uses of radio as a practice of cultural production among new immigrant communities in the US during the course of the 20th century. So I begin with my own introduction to Pakistani radio in Houston to demonstrate my surprise at the importance of radio within the local South Asian communities in Houston. I had not planned to study radio, and it was certainly not on my radar as a viable field site for ethnographic research. None of the published research on South Asian communities in the US that I'd consulted prior to commencing fieldwork had critically analyzed non-English language ethnic radio among new immigrant communities. Yet, as gleaned from the vignette below, radio appeared to play a central role in negotiations of transnational belonging and community among the local Pakistani population. So, the vignette. I'd been in Houston for less than a week when I realized the difficulty in figuring out where cultural life took place for my interlocutors, Pakistani Americans and Pakistani immigrants. Like many new immigrant communities in Houston, Pakistanis also reside throughout the greater Houston area. Even in sections of Southwest Houston, where Pakistani businesses and residential enclaves predominate, Pakistanis are part of an ethnically and racially diverse landscape. During this initial period of research, I could not discern a recognizable South Asian ethnic center that would not only anchor my research, but also provide me with a sense of ethnic rootedness and belonging in an as yet unfamiliar city. On one of my first exploratory visits, wondering how in a city as vast and populous as Houston I would ever find Pakistani interlocutors, I got into a cab to explore Hillcroft Avenue. And Hillcroft is one of the arteries that has a lot of Indian, Pakistani businesses and residences, and also community and civic organizations based there. So I got into the cab to explore Hillcroft Avenue. The cab driver was Wasim, a middle-aged Pakistani man. As I learned during the ride, Wasim had relocated with his family from New York City to Houston a few years earlier. I wanted to be closer to my brother who lives here, he told me. Besides, it's tough to raise a family in New York. Life is so fast there. Houston is better that way. As we continued our conversation, Wasim headed south on Hillcroft Avenue. I looked out the window and saw storefronts advertising Middle Eastern businesses in English and Arabic. Passing Harwin Drive, Arab language storefronts are replaced by South Asian and Latino businesses with storefronts in Urdu, Hindi, and Spanish. The blazing late summer sun and the oppressive humidity gave sidewalks and strip malls a deserted look. Large, nondescript parking lots occupied by car dealerships, commercial high-rises, and roadways leading into gated communities gave way to open fields and prairie land. I was taking in the sights when Wasim asked me, "So what brings you to Houston?" My research is on Pakistanis here, their cultural life. I began to explain. "You must listen to the radio then," he said as he turned up the volume of the car radio. A Pakistani folk song permeated the cab. A male radio programmer speaking in Urdu introduced the next song. Wasim continued, quote, "There's so many Pakistani radio programs on 1150 AM. It is basically a Pakistani radio station. I always listen to it whenever I'm driving. The programs are on all the time. You learn much about Pakistanis from listening to radio," end quote. So wandering around in a taxi cab looking for interlocutors for my research, I was thus first introduced to Pakistani radio in Houston. Importantly, Wasim had not taken me to the more familiar space of an ethnic enclave or pointed me to the similarly familiar institutional space of a mosque or a Pakistani community-based organization. Instead, Wasim had directed me to look for the Pakistani community through its participation in the airwaves of commercial radio. The preference for radio as a medium for mass communication among South Asians in Houston invokes the historical significance of radio as a tool for nation and community building in Pakistan. As one of my interlocutors, a Pakistani radio program host, said to me, quote, "We bring our habits from home, and we always have been radio people, newspaper people. That is where we get our information from." Radio also represents the medium to which my interlocutors have turned since the early decades of Pakistani immigration to Texas. Pakistanis are relatively new entrants to the ethnic landscape in Houston, arriving in large numbers only in the 1970s. During the 1970s, middle-class professionals, most of whom were employed in the hospitals, aerospace industry, and in the oil exploration and construction sectors, along with students at local universities, constituted the majority of the Pakistani population. It was in 1978 that the first Pakistani radio program began broadcast in Houston. The program was called and the translation in English is A Galaxy of Stars, and was produced and hosted by a Pakistani husband and wife team who had been producing radio programs for the state-sponsored Radio Pakistan in Pakistan. They utilized their knowledge of radio production and programming to start the program in Houston. After an extremely popular 12-year run, the program went off the air when Salim, the husband, passed away. A dramatically revamped program began broadcasting in 1990 when Salim's friend, also a regular volunteer with the program, convinced Salim's wife to restart it. Galaxy of Star attempted to represent a culturally conceived diasporic community, inclusive of all South Asian nationality groups residing locally. In a 1983 interview published in the oldest South Asian newspaper in Houston, Mr. Salim emphasized that the audience for his program included both Pakistanis as well as the local Indian communities. The newspaper quotes Mr. Salim as saying that the programs were, quote, for people who want to remember their culture and language. There's not much difference in the Pakistani and Indian culture. People on both sides listen to the same music and songs. It is for people who want to keep in touch with their roots and understand their origin better, end quote. By the early 2000s, the program had become part of a widely diversified Pakistani media landscape that included over 15 regularly scheduled radio programs, several Pakistani newspapers in the English and Urdu language, Asian India radio programs, multiplex cinemas that show Indian films, Bollywood films several times daily. These radio programs are broadcast throughout Greater Houston on 3 different AM stations. By the year 2001, Pakistani radio programs reflected also the internal diversity within the local population and represented a wide range of professional, class, and ethno-linguistic backgrounds such as Punjabi, Sindhi, Pathan, Balochi. Moreover, these hosts included recently arrived working-class Pakistanis as well as second and third generation Pakistani-American professionals. Radio had come to symbolize a public space and venue that brought together the varied waves of Pakistani migrations to the US and transcended differences of class, age, generation, geography, and gender. It is not these transnational intersections with radio, though, in the homeland that make it familiar. Ethnic radio also represents established patterns of cultural production among new immigrant communities in the US. During the course of my research, I spent time with the administrative staff at the studios from where these programs are broadcast. On one occasion, I was sitting with the station manager, Elizabeth Melendez, a second-generation Mexican-American woman in her 40s. As we sat in her office chatting over coffee, our conversation was often interrupted by program hosts who stopped by. Sohail, a second-generation Pakistani-American who co-hosted an Urdu language program, had brought 2 of his children with him to the studios. As Sohail spoke with Elizabeth, his children kept running around making noise. Sohail, embarrassed, apologized for his children. As Sohail left, Elizabeth smiled with understanding, turned to me and said, "You know, this reminds me of me when I was a child in the 1970s. My father was a Mexican immigrant, and he started his radio program in this studio as a hobby, as a way for him to feel connected to his culture. He would bring us to the studios, and we would always be running around just like Sohail's children. When I see these kids, it reminds me of how my father got involved with Spanish language radio. That is how I became interested in radio. This is how we got started, and now Spanish language radio is everywhere." I recall this conversation as one of the light bulb moments in my research that enabled me to imagine the possibility of Pakistani radio as a site of convergence between new immigrants and earlier waves of immigrant communities in Texas and elsewhere in the US. Histories of non-English language radio in the US show how immigrant communities have utilized it as a vehicle for negotiating experiences of marginality and racism in mainstream American media industries. Specifically, Spanish language radio in Texas during the 20th century And Pakistani radio today reflects similar genealogies and progressions, from community-based nonprofit initiatives to marketing tools for business, and as spaces of commerce that reach audiences locally, regionally, and nationally. This growth in Spanish language radio has required alliance building and ongoing accommodations of difference among varied South Asian and Central American nationality communities. The convergences between Pakistani and Spanish language radio suggest not only models of growth for South Asian radio in Houston, but also potentialities for greater solidarities across, between South Asian radio programmers across religion and nations of ancestral affiliation. Alas, my discussion about this issue with several different Pakistani radio hosts was met with pointed reservation. When I mentioned my conversation with Elizabeth Shehzad, a radio program host, a Pakistani radio program host, and asked if he anticipated something similar happening, he said, quote, "Maybe it will down the road. I think a lot of it has to do with advertising money. It is scarce. We, Indian and Pakistani radio hosts, are all fighting for that dollar, so sometimes that brings in a bit of bitterness. I hope that we will get over it and realize that if we can coexist, we will all do a little better." And my interlocutors' misgivings were based on a recurrence of tensions between South Asian radio program hosts, as well as between Pakistani and Indians on issues of sponsorship. Indeed, this construction of difference and antagonism has undermined the ability of Pakistani radio to collaborate and build alliances with other South Asian nationality programs. In conclusion, analytical consideration of Pakistani programs in Houston shows the tremendous endurance and relevance of radio, a technology over a century old in the life of new immigrant communities in the US. Pakistani programs provide an important ethnographic site to denaturalize the taken for granted frames and expand the horizons and varied uses and meanings of radio among new immigrant communities. As a practice of diasporic community building, Pakistani radio demonstrates the ability to mediate differences between South Asian nationality groups as well as accentuate them. I'm thinking that it may be the end, so I'm just gonna end here. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here, to be invited as a discussant for this executive session that features papers that represent new research in critical Americanist anthropology and American studies more broadly, and I want to thank you for an opportunity to be a part of this session. In Ahmed's paper that he just finished reading about Urdu language radio in Houston, he uses the journey in conversation with a Pakistani cab driver as a reminder of one of the most valuable gifts in anthropology, and that is the value that we place on mundane, quotidian encounters in our lives to provide profound and meaningful insight into our complex cultural, political, and social lives. In his paper, Ahmad captures how the routine question a cab driver often asks his traveler, "What brings you to Houston?" How a simple question like that can radically transform our methodological approach to trying to understand where cultural life takes place. And I just thought that was really beautifully captured in his paper. If you're interested in cultural life, if you're interested in the cultural life of Pakistanis in Houston, the cabbie notes, quote, "You must listen to radio." And the beauty of this man's remarks is not only the direct simplicity, and then the fact that he turns on the radio or turns up the volume and you can hear a Pakistani folk song, but it's also the reminder of how the familiar and ubiquitous features that structure so much of our lives, like radio stations, musicians, sports like basketball, and churches, are simultaneously sites of unexpected and important affinities, community building, boundary construction, and identity formation. And that's precisely what these 4 papers do so well for us this morning. They invite us to think critically, they invite us to critically examine these familiar spaces and locations in American daily life, and to see the strange and surprising and precious insights they can generate in deepening our understanding of American racialization projects that we all know are far more complicated and nuanced than the broader public and academic discourse often suggest. This attention to the mundane spaces and places for understanding American racialization projects is more urgent than ever. In a historical moment in which our lives are increasingly defined by race and class-based polarization, violence at the hands of deeply militarized police forces, and in a moment of virulent anti-immigrant sentiment and hostility, as well as class-based exclusions that have a profound impact on national discourses of belonging, critical Americanist anthropology and these particular projects have a lot to offer. This kind of work builds on a lot of what we already know, what is familiar about immigration, practices of transnational community building, the role of powerful institutions like churches in facilitating feelings of belonging, and the importance of cultural production and sports as vehicles for inclusion. But these papers also offer important new insights that demand exploration. And to some of those insights, I now turn to the papers. And they're not in order that they were presented, but I'm going to cover all 4 of them. Suhei's paper provides a much-needed exploration of the experiences of Latinas and Latinos in the Church of Latter-day Saints. In what has become a familiar statistic that Latinos, that we're the largest, youngest, and fastest-growing demographic in the United States today, we can see a similar trend in LDS, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, that Latinos are the fastest-growing group in the Mormon Church, and as Suhei insightfully demonstrates in her paper, they are playing a critical role in, quote, ethnically asserting their own vision and practices of culture and faith within an otherwise purposefully homogenous institution like the LDS Church, unquote. And her larger goal of the project is to explore, quote, how white LDS members respond to this growing population in their meeting houses, unquote. While Vega provides a nuanced analysis of the way Latinas, in particular, develop valuable women-centered networks of support within LDS, and this is something she explored in her paper more than in the presentation today that I really appreciated. While these women develop these women-centered networks within LDS that do not disrupt the marginal status of women and children within the Mormon Church, she identifies incredible moments of quiet and direct resistance to the racialization and stigmatization of Latinos and immigrants when the one 67-year-old woman challenges her white brethren to quote, take down political flyers supporting Russell Pierce, who was the architect of SB 1070, at the meeting house, saying to Suhei, I mean, ¿qué es eso? They shouldn't have had put this up in the first place, suggesting that while Latina LDS members recognize and work through patriarchal constraints, the racialization projects undergirding anti-immigrant legislations have no place within their church. These insights lead me to ask the following questions to Suhei and others who are thinking specifically about the intersections of race, gender, and Latina autonomy. How do we understand the ways in which Latinas successfully operate within some of the most hierarchical, patriarchal, and hypermasculine spaces like LDS, the Catholic Church, and in my own research, the US military and military programs, to create spaces for autonomy and leadership development and the exercise of their own agency? And how might these spaces allow for the support and development of critical identity formation that can challenge exclusions based on gender, race, and class? This is something I found very interesting in your paper and would love to see more fully developed. These strange and surprising spaces for the development of Latina agency extend beyond churches to include the familiar locations of music and musical cultural production that Sam Bird explores in his paper. As part of a new research exploring the presence and impact of Latino communities in the Nuevo South, Bird invites us to think about a familiar experience in the development of pan-ethnic identity, or Latinidad, but to focus on the distinctive and strangeness of a Southern Latinidad. By focusing on the experiences of musicians, DJs, and political activists in Charlotte, Sam locates how Latino musicians navigate what he refers to as, quote, the never-ending episodes of racial oppression and revanchist policing of communities of color in the United States, unquote, and their particular iteration in the US South. In his work, he demonstrates not only the ways that Latino musicians, quote, consent to common sense notions of racial hierarchy through their cultural production, but he also highlights the ways that these same musicians challenge these constructions through their construction of a Southern Latinidad that he describes as looser than other conceptions, and that reflects both their social isolation away from whites and blacks in Charlotte, as well as the surprising affinities and connections with a heterogeneous Latino and Caribbean population in the city. So while fear and the balkanization of Latino media and the presence of particular gatekeepers like DJs and club owners, for example, are key in hardening the lines between Latinos and the broader society. The musical and cultural practices of musicians creates a space for challenging what he calls racial common sense notions of cultural difference, unquote, that is often reproduced through music by developing new cultural practices that challenge dominant and stigmatizing discourses around Mexicans, for example, or that seek solidarity across genres, for example, across merengue and banda. What I would have liked to read more about is, and maybe further conversation, is how these cultural practices might be spaces for political activism, and I think he starts to allude to this at the end of his paper. But I would like to see how this might change in light of the events of this summer, of incredible racialized violence against Black communities and Black churches, and specifically in the South, and to know whether the tensions and isolation between Latino and African American communities might be transformed in light of recent events, and how cultural practices might reflect these new moments of solidarity and racialization. I'm also interested in understanding how the notion of Southern Latinidad that you allude to, and I think could contribute significantly to conversations in Latino studies and in Latino ethnography, kind of to flesh that out about what is specific about Southern Latinidad and kind of contributing to our notion of Latinidades more broadly. While Sam's work on music provides a familiar way of thinking through Latinidad and racialization projects, Stan's paper, focusing on the role of sport, and specifically basketball, provides a refreshing and new line of inquiry for thinking about racialization projects, and builds on the important work of historians such as Adrian Burgos' scholarship on race, Latinos, and baseball. By turning to basketball and South Asian participation in Atlanta, Stan is able to capture, quote, the fluidity and exclusionary politics of whiteness, Blackness, and otherness that play out in multiple and contradictory ways, unquote. In Atlanta, Stan beautifully demonstrates sports culture is an important site to explore the use of racial language and how they're reproduced and challenged by young South Asian men. So while the familiarity of Blackness is bound up with dominant narratives of, quote, aggressiveness and toughness and frequent bouts of fighting on the court, Stan draws our attention to class and the ways that class and economic mobility and aspirations and consumption intersect with these narratives as well. These experiences of South Asian youth in Atlanta are in sharp contrast to those of Kurdish young men in Nashville, whose racialization in, quote, everyday discourses and institutional records, unquote, are both the site of contestation and reproduction of their marginalization in a post 9/11 world. And turning his attention to the ways Kurds claim status through claims to Indo-European heritage, which I just really found fascinating, Stan correctly identifies the ways that racialization projects are always simultaneously bound up with ideas about gender and gender identity construction. And at the end of his paper refers to different veiling practices in Nashville. And so what I would like to know more about is how this intersectional approach of thinking about gender and race play out in the context of sports in Atlanta. And how are racialization projects being transformed in relation to ideas about girls in sports, for example? And I would love to know more about gender veiling and racialization projects in Nashville as well. And finally, Ahmed's focus on radio, which was the opening frame for my remarks this morning, provide a final, new, and strange focus on racialization projects for today's panel. As I noted before, this paper represents new directions focusing on media and its role in the making and unmaking of South Asian diaspora in Texas. And one of the most interesting insights from Ahmed's paper was the interaction he had with Elizabeth Melendez, a second-generation Mexican-American woman who was the station manager, who took immense delight in the connection she made between seeing Sohail's children playing in the station, just as she and her siblings had done so many years before when her father had his own Spanish-language radio show. Her delight is not only about this kind of cross-cultural recognition, but for a kind of potentiality and for seeing the familiar in something that is new and strange in the racial landscape. Quote, this is how we got started, unquote, she explains to Ahmed. Now Spanish language is everywhere. In a similar way, thinking of racialization projects beyond Black and white has a long history, but we now find ourselves in a political moment that requires continued and sustained attention to these questions. And these papers, I suggest, is how we get started. Thank you.
Good morning. So what I think I'm going to do is take a different tact from the one that Gina took. I will tell you, I thought the papers were wonderfully evocative. I'd almost say too much so, because I wrote so many notes and I got back and realized I couldn't even read the many notes I wrote, so I rewrote them and rewrote them again. But I think part of what, for me, that speaks to is the extent to which I feel like part of what this panel is trying to get us to think about, and I do feel like anthropology at this point needs to reboot in terms of its appreciation of and understanding of its relationship to larger discourses about race and racialization. I think we've fallen into this trap of thinking we're kind of a one-trick pony, right? And the idea simply is we continue to hammer home the race as a social construction idea, show them all the ways in which it isn't biological. We make the case that its value comes out of the fact that we can dislodge it from these sort of poor quasi-biological understandings. And it's almost like we think we can put our pen and pads away and go on about our business as though the job is done. And I think some of what this panel and the papers thereof get us to think through are our, and all of our, and I'll claim my own inconsistencies on race, all of our complicated, cathected inconsistencies about how we think about this category, this trope, this organizing principle for how we understand the world and our various places in it. And I think the papers do, in very different ways, a wonderful job of showing us why even this idea of getting beyond black and white is much more complicated than you think it would be. So I'm actually teaching a course this semester at Penn on American racism. And I'm only teaching it because so many faculty and students and alumni have been complaining about how the class is structured. And the argument basically is this is a class that was concocted in the 1970s and still reads as though we're in that moment. Still feels like nothing's changed in America in the last 40 years. And so students in the moment now are saying, this doesn't give me the tools, the conceptual frameworks I need to make sense of the current moment. And I think what each one of these papers in very different kinds of ways is trying to get us to understand is we have to build a new toolkit for making sense of this stuff. And it means recognizing that we've all been complicit in a certain understanding of race as parochial, almost in this kind of intellectually imperialist way, right? This is almost an imposition of a certain version in a certain moment of an American preoccupation with a biologization of difference. And so what I wanted to do is maybe talk about 5 specific themes that the papers made me think about that I feel like they do a nice job of helping to thematize for us and hopefully pushing us, I know they've pushed me, to think differently about how we write this stuff. Ultimately, also how we live it, too. But I'll start with low-hanging fruit, I think, is how we write it. So the first thing, again, is that this binary isn't a simple one, that the categories can be fixed and fungible at the same time, right? It's a whiteness that can be quite expansive, right? Can let in different folks in different points in time. Also, a blackness in the black-white iteration of things that can do a whole bunch of different work. The lines between them can be policed differently in different moments by different constituents towards different ends. Part of what becomes important, I think, to remember is that ultimately, I think the reason why race works and why we talk so much about racialization, at least the reason why I write about it so much, is because it's not something that we can understand except, I would argue, insofar as we recognize that when race takes as a logic, as a reasoning, as an organizing principle for how you think about the world, it constitutes in an almost existential way who and what people think they are. So it's not just the lens through which you see the world, which almost sounds almost too simple and superficial. It's actually about how you understand yourself. And so that's why deconstruction can be such a radical project, because we can deconstruct this category to death. And ultimately, what it ends up doing, I would argue, if it's working, is imagining, purporting to disappear ourselves out of existence. Now, that isn't to say, again, that that's because race is so ontologically real. It's pre-culture. It's to say that part of what we have to recognize is the power of culture, is that it constitutes us. Right? So we only interact in and through its frameworks and under its auspices. And so how do we make sense of what this binary allows us to do and the kinds of ways in which, if we reconfigure it, if we push beyond it, we might be able to imagine different relationships between various versions of us and them. And so each paper, in a very different way, talks about how movable this notion of this binary, black-white, can be, and why it's important to think not just beyond in a way that seems to be about transcending and not recognizing the constitutive, legacy-based commitments that the past brings to bear on the present, but to recognize, actually, if we get the current moment and take it and get it right and take it seriously, we actually can reinterpret some of what we imagine to be the historical facts of the matter about how race has functioned in the past. And so I think that's really important. The papers do a nice job of that. Second thing, in different ways, some more explicitly than others, thinking about the relationship between race, I'm going to say, and democracy, but I would say that in and through the category of mass mediation in the media. And we're not just talking about sort of South Asians in Houston on the radio, but recognizing that one of the projects that becomes very important is being able to create a narrative that can circulate about the value of these particular investments. And so thinking about the ways in which, these are all NYU Press books, so my, contribution to the NYU Press party is a book coming out 2017 with Carolyn Rouse and Marla Frederick around race, religion, and mass mediation called Televised Redemption. The argument simply being that to really understand how and why race helps us think about this transnational sort of postmodern present means we have to go in and through these mechanisms whereby we communicate it through electronic media and through all kinds of mass mediative possibilities. And so thinking about how in each one of these instances, whether it's the specific deployment of musical forms and genres to create a new version of what it means to be in the South in a contemporary moment, or recognizing all the ways in which your project, as someone who's not supposed to be in the LDS and is anyway, is about trying to control a narrative that isn't simply an interpersonal narrative, but that's one that's playing out on social media all the time, right? These questions about, I am LDS, and it isn't your stereotypical notion of LDS. It's all about, I think, some of those issues. And recognizing ultimately that part of what race is about, it's about purporting to claim that you can find sort of biophysical matter that's somehow out of place, isn't where it's supposed to be, isn't where it belongs, right? Race wouldn't even be important, wouldn't have the traction I think it has as a way of understanding the world if we didn't imagine it made a difference, of course, in how people behaved, right? That's a presupposition. If we didn't see it in action, I'm not sure it would have the longevity it's had. And so in different ways, each one of these papers tries to play with what racialized communities do, what they're supposed to do, what they authentically do, how they change and reconfigure the expectations people have about what particular kinds of peoples are expected to do. And I think that was something that really came through in each piece in very powerful ways. There is also always this, I think, interesting relationship between, and people have written incredibly compelling arguments about how this has played out historically, between vernacular or folk deployments and understandings of race and what we as academicians can bring to the table. I think of Stan's piece, and you see, opens with this discussion of this 1923 decision, an impossible subject, does a nice job of laying out how, in this moment, we see an example of the futility, the insignificance, ultimately, or at least the partiality of a social constructionist argument, where we have a Supreme Court justice saying, well, race science might say South Asians are Caucasian. That might be what science tells us, but the common white Southerner doesn't see it that way. That's racist social construction. That's saying it doesn't matter. What you're saying up here, what the science ostensibly is telling you, is different from the sort of self-evidential, commonsensical understanding of the community, and that's what will take primacy, right? That's what will actually get codified into law. It's such a powerful moment. And there's another way in which we need to think about our relationship to these larger circulating discourses. I think that's also important. I think the final thing I'll say is each one of these papers, some very explicitly, just about all of them explicitly, are trying to get us to think about what these discussions about race in a post-civil rights moment, in a multiracial, multi-ethnic American moment, tells us about the very category of citizenship. Who can be a citizen, who can't. Makes me think of Devin Carbato's work about how the difference between American identity and American citizenship. American citizenship might be an official category of belonging, might mean recognition by the state, but being American means assimilating a certain understanding of racial hierarchy and privilege. It means internalizing that. He does this wonderful job, this very personal story of his own as a black Brit, his own introduction to American identity and the logics thereof. It's different, he wants to argue, from American citizenship. I thought that was powerful. And for him, it's also clearly always lived in and through these sort of connected categories. So it's gendered in ways a lot of the pieces have tried to get us to think about today. It's an understanding of identity, of commitment, of community that says there's this fantasy out there, and I think it is a fantasy. It's a sort of post-racial fantasy, that if we somehow can push back against and inoculate ourselves from racial reasoning in any way, then we can find these universal subjects, right? These subjects that aren't tied to particularity. It's this Habermasian model of being able to have these reasoned brains that can articulate their conversations in ways that aren't saddled with cultural particularity, with the stuff of race or religion, any of the things that make us human, arguably. And that if we can get to this rarefied state, we can and we have created a polity that somehow won't be trapped in all of these atavistic and primitive ways of understanding connectivity and community. And so for me, what I want to end on is the fact that in each one of these papers, they get us to think both about how we can imagine not just sort of race in the US being much more complicated than some of the stereotypical understandings out there and in the academy of the history of that story might lead us to believe. But that to understand race in the US is to recognize that this is always a global conversation. It's always been a transnational conversation, not just in 2015, but in 1923, and then clearly in the 19th and 18th and 17th century. And so to think about how, and each one of these papers does it differently, to think about how we can learn to recognize the limitations of the black-white model of what it means to think about race in America, while doing it in a way that allows us to see how and why our commitment is into educating ourselves, educating other folks, to understand not the project to be one of trying to get beyond or transcend a sort of simplistic notion of what it means to be a racialized subject, but I think to recognize the reality of the fact, and Roger Sanjak, I think, said this very well, that the future of us all is thinking about sameness and difference, us and them, in ways that tries to forge coalitional politics across whatever difference they might prop up, whatever difference might be policed, and to think about how those coalitions can work, how those differences can actually produce and create community, not endanger them, right, is another way I think each one of these papers in very different ways gets us to reimagine our commitment to the value of ambivalence, of difference, and of a notion of raciality that I think helps us to get beyond not just what's strange about it, what's familiar, and clearly that's something we've always been thinking about, this trope of trying to make the strange familiar, the familiar strange. But it's this way of trying, I think, to really hone in on the extent to which we can get ourselves to recognize the productive force of the cultural. And it's a productive force that usually when we deploy it in the popular and public sphere gets impoverished and trivialized in these ways that become incredibly flat-footed and reified. But that anthropologists, I think, can help to make a much more rigorous, nuanced, and sophisticated understanding of not sort of culture as puppet master and predetermining impacts on the kinds of choices, decisions we make as agents, but a notion of culture that says, let's try to figure out how it can be that there's more to say about race than that's just a prison house, it's just a carceral state that stops us from thinking about community. Because if that's the case, I think I would argue every form of cultural identification, every way in which we're human, has that potentiality. But that's not, I think, the most effective and fundamentally powerful way to add to an ongoing conversation in a neoliberal moment about the value of these questions for folks who would imagine it's even silly to talk about it at all. And so for me, going back to a campus where folks are trying to mobilize, thinking about how these questions aren't just theoretical and conceptual, but impact even the hallowed halls of the Ivy Leagues and the academy, I want us to remember that each one of these papers in different ways gives us a key into reminding us exactly what it is we know about race. So we know we've heard a lot of this stuff before, but a key that we can turn one more rotation to bring a slightly different perspective to some of the stuff we think we've already understood and taken for granted about racial reality for us and for the kind of communities we want to build. And ultimately, I think these are questions that are about social justice. It's about what kind of society we want to build, what kind of possibilities we think we want to be invested in bringing to fruition. And I think the papers show us, both historically and in contemporary moment, the investments other people make, various kinds of communities, and not just identifying with one localized, racialized community or another, which is a kind of segmented assimilation model of how we think about these things, but how they actually model for us a way of understanding commitments to connection, to community, to identity, that if we take them seriously, give us roadmaps for how we can create versions of national belonging that I think we haven't quite seen before. And I think a lot of what's emerging here is both new and old, but the aspects of it that haven't been thematized before, I think we should hold on and make sure not just we translate to everyone who should hear it, but that we figure out what lessons we can make sure we double down on to educate people about the things that they take for granted about race that actually usually means they're not taking race seriously, I would argue, at all. And these 4 papers definitely, short as they were, definitely did. So thanks.
For discussion, and I was wondering if, before we open it up, if the panelists and presenters had any reactions to both, each other's papers or to the discussants, before we open it up. Anyone want to? Go ahead.
Thank you for the comments and the ways in which, it connects to a much more complex model. I think both of the discussants and all the papers giving us a very different intersectional model of not just how you study race, but also how you practice it. And I think, your question about, the intersectional approach and how it plays out is also a way that I think all of our papers attend to how the politics of identity and the politics of community is always built along this, this spectrum of inclusion and exclusion, and how are we to critically study those politics of always inclusion and exclusion that can also really play a critical role in the type of teaching we do in this historical moment where Mizzou and Yale are not the exceptional cases, but rather they should be the normal and the standard by which we think about how these politics of exclusion and inclusion play out in how we live these racial lives within the university. I think there's a microphone there. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question for Stanley and Sam. And since all black people are not African American, but all black people get categorized under this African American label, I was wondering if you looked at the relationship between African immigrants and Afro-Caribbeans, and also I was wondering if you looked at, Sam, if you looked at sports, if you looked at like a sport like European football instead of like basketball, which is so stereotypical African American. I wonder if you would see some differences in the gaps you've seen between, Southeast Asians and black people.
Thank you for that question. And I think, in the paper, I intentionally used at various times African American and black, to see the ways in which that element of difference where, with increasing refugee migration of Somalis, to Atlanta, where Clarkston, suburb of Atlanta, is the largest refugee space in the U.S. right now. And so the ways in which, Ahmad Afzal's work really deals with this, how the idea of Islam becomes an open category that allows, a lot of African Muslims to come into that space. So when there were 3-on-3 basketball tournaments sponsored by the local mosque, you see so many more African athletes there, recent immigrants and refugees. And so the ways in which you see certain types of alliances and friendships form through the realm of Islam, but that don't form when you leave that religious space into other sporting spaces, where all of a sudden, the heterogeneity within blackness is just dismissed for the ways in which the corporal black body is just seen as so innately athletic and aggressive, and as the very threat to a merit-based space of sport, that sport should always be about merit, so that blackness actually serves to justify the merit and the hard work of South Asians, right? So in that moment, that blackness, even though we know it is heterogeneous, it is collapsed and essentialized. And that also happened with the Kurds I'm in Nashville, where the most important day for the activists was Eid, right? So to celebrate, the end of Ramadan, you have the huge 20,000 Kurdish community and the 15,000 Somali community out in the center of Nashville, right? And you have all these kinds of incredible coalitional and immigrant rights activists there. But those spaces become, so the public political space becomes a space where you can create a coalition, but once you leave that space, we live in very different parts of the city, and we socialize, and we eat in different spaces across Nashville.
And it's a great question. I would add, and I didn't get to this in my paper, but in my book and other places I talk about it, there is a lot of sort of cross intermingling and collaboration between the Spanish-speaking Caribbean immigrants to Charlotte and Jamaicans and other West Indians, where there's for example, an artist named Ras Congo who performed with Bacalao Stars, and they sort of collaborated on an album together. There's also some commonalities between Jamaicans and Brazilians, which I include in the sort of catch-all term Latino, in my book at least, because I think that the cultures there's some similarities there, and so I agree. I think you do have to you can't just use African American as a catch-all term as well, and sometimes we're a little too easy with these terms when we throw them out there, but it is important to sort of parse some of the differences and similarities and transnationalism that goes on in these communities.
Yeah, and also, the ways in which religion and race intersect to create exceptions, right? So the building of the mosque in Atlanta and the putting up the basketball court, they said, well, we already have Muslim, role models in the NBA. Akeem Olajuwon, Sharif Abdul-Rahim, so there are these spaces that can be open.
Don't really have time, but as a kind of expression of renegadeness, if you will, does anyone want to have any last minute quick, especially for the rest of the panel? Before they boot us out?
I guess one last minute comment I'd like to make is just I'm thankful for the continuing conversations that are happening in anthropology. As was stated in the last comment, that we're having to reimagine anthropology in race politics. And I'm thankful for the fact that those conversations are happening, albeit in limited ways. But I know that when I was coming into anthropology, these conversations were unheard of in the AAAs, with the exception of maybe one or two panels. And so I'm hopeful that will revamp or reboot the field.
I'm okay.
Well, and can I just make a final comment? And to thank, and it's so critical to also in our work to cite and to bring into, our scholarship the work done by communities and scholars of color, right? And the fact that in this space we have Gina Perez and John Jackson, whose work has influenced all of our works. I mean, I got into thinking about basketball because of Birthdays in Basketball, right, that chapter. So, and so I'm very, very grateful for the scholars of color who have done that incredible work. And we have two others here with Alejandro Lugo and Martin. So thank you.